Bugsy is a 1991 crime drama romance directed by Barry Levinson concerning the life of notorious gangster Bugsy Siegel and his exploits in kickstarting the Las Vegas casino scene by building the Flamingo Hotel. The movie stars Warren Beatty as Bugsy, Annette Bening as his girlfriend Virginia Hill, Ben Kingsley as his close associate and businessman Meyer Lansky, and Harvey Keitel as Bugsy's underling, the gangster Mickey Cohen. This review does contain a few spoilers. I mean, they're not really spoilers. It would be like saying Al Capone goes to prison in the end is a spoiler for a Capone movie. But either way, you have been warned. Bugsy Siegel was one of the most well-known gangsters of the 20th century. He was known for being handsome and charismatic, and it's unlikely a movie on his life could cover everything of significance, as Bugsy is thought to be one of the murderers of Joe Mantegna, one of the notable events which created the National Crime Syndicate. Bugsy was also a boyhood friend of Al Capone, a close associate of the likes of the commission creator Charles Luciano. He was one of the founders of Murder Incorporated, the notorious law enforcement of the mob, which is thought to have carried out hundreds of killings. Siegel also was in the highest circles of the Hollywood crowd, associating with the likes of George Raft, Clark Gable, Gary Cooper, and Cary Grant. So as you can see, the filmmakers made the right choice in not trying to squeeze all the events of Bugsy's life into a comprehensive biography. Instead, the film is concerned with Bugsy's time in the 1940s trying to reinvent his image and dive into the legitimate business world with Las Vegas casinos. It follows his eccentric dream of building a heaven on earth in the middle of the desert, using cash from his mob associates like Meyer Lansky and Charles Luciano to fund it. Siegel's extravagant dreams become more and more expensive, and the mob become more and more frustrated with how much of their money is being poured into a project that might never make a return, which threatens to sour the relationship between Bugsy and his associates, and puts his life in danger. To be honest, the movie is only partly focused on that, as it dedicates a frustratingly long amount of time to a bizarre romance between Bugsy and Virginia. And by bizarre, I mean a narcissistic and self-absorbed set of personalities, two flip sides of the same coin, which involves a lot of shoes being thrown, money being stolen, shouting matches, hissy fits, and annoying tantrums. It's hard to decide at times which one of the two is worse than the other. Anyway, one of the striking things about this film is the way they captured the time period and the feel of old school Las Vegas. The cars, the suits, the colours, the girls, everything about the look of the film was on point. It had the sense of glamour and charisma that is associated with both Vegas and Bugsy Siegel. It's a lavish, big-budgeted production. It also harks back to the golden age of Hollywood. At times I felt as though if the film was black and white, I'd half expect James Cagney or Humphrey Bogart to pop up. I also loved some of the shots Levinson pulled off, like one part where we see the two characters' shadows behind a projector curtain as they start to do the hanky-panky. However, the movie is also reminiscent of those old talkies in a bad way as well, as there were some things that felt outdated even for a film made in the 90s. Like say the thwack sound anytime someone got punched, or even the casting of Warren Beatty as Bugsy Siegel, a typical good-looking and charming Hollywood leading man, because he looks quite out of place and odd surrounded by greasy Italian Americans and Jewish mobsters. I'll get into that later, but one thing you do notice with Bugsy is that it doesn't really seem to be made with the intention of being a Bugsy biography, what with the numerous deviations from the truth. Gangster movies always embellish things, it comes with the territory. But many notable crime films such as Goodfellas or The Irishman are told from a certain character's point of view, so we can take what they say and the things they present with a pinch of salt, because they're telling the story from their point of view. Bugsy doesn't have such narrative techniques. It's pretty straightforward in that regard, and as such doesn't have much of an excuse for so many inaccuracies. It seems like Levinson was more interested in telling a story of an eccentric entrepreneur who wants to build something extravagant in the least likely of places, like Werner Herzog's Fitzgerald, or maybe even Martin Scorsese's The Aviator, and he used Bugsy's life as a template, and to do so, the filmmakers have had to shave off a lot of details and make things up. For example, The movie had Bugsy stand in the middle of the desert and have an epiphany, a vision of Las Vegas with lavish casinos, the best champagne, swimming pools, and whatnot, and he begins construction using mob money on the Flamingo Hotel. But the Flamingo Hotel was already there. It was William Wilkinson's idea. Siegel came along after the fact and strong-handed his way into taking things over in typical Mafia style. And no way would the mob put up their own money for the construction of the hotels. The thing is, Siegel was an extortionist, he was a fraudster, a gangster, even a rapist, and yet the movie is so romanticized, so lacking in nuance, that it essentially portrays Bugsy as a kind of happy-go-lucky, lovable, eccentric dreamer. And sure, he was charismatic and charming, and in typical Warren Beatty fashion, Beatty captured that perfectly. But they threw out all the other elements of Bugsy's ruthlessness and unhinged personality to create this narrative. They have had to change so much of the facts so that Bugsy comes off as this charming man who was hard done by people around him, like his girlfriend skimming money off the casino, and that no one understood his vision and his dream only manifested after he died. And they even throw in some really weird subplots like Bugsy trying to kill the Italian fascist Benito Mussolini to evoke further sympathy and envy of this childlike sense of wonder and imagination. There's even a part where he forces a man to sell his house to him, and the way it's played with the victim, practically foaming at the mouth due to Bugsy's charm, it's like the filmmakers wanted us to react like, oh, that rascal Bugsy. This is complete bullshit. Bugsy didn't create Las Vegas. He himself was thought to be skimming the casino, hence being sent for and taken out by his mobster associates. He did live to see the success of the Flamingo. He was notorious for his violence and unpredictable behavior, but the movie is some kind of hero worship of the man. It throws all that stuff out the window. But in order to become the hero worship it has to bastardize all the facts. All the women fawn over him in the film. The music and the mood of certain scenes are telling in that we're supposed to be on his side when he comes across as a complete asshole. It feels like a Warren Beatty vanity film. I mean, let me give you a good example. The movie chooses not to highlight how he may have been stealing money from the casino. Okay, we don't really know if he did that or not in real life, so I'll give the film that. They blame it all on the girlfriend, and she leaves, but then comes back as soon as Bugsy leaves after he's been summoned by the mob. And there's a kind of final scene between the two in an airfield in front of a plane, like it's trying way too hard to be the climax of Casablanca, another way in which the movie harks back to classic Hollywood. But anyway, after Siegel's death, the film tells us that Virginia committed suicide, in such a way that obviously she must have had too much grief and guilt over Bugsy's death, and yet they omit to tell us that she actually committed suicide over 10 years later. She found another man and everything, had a son, and even her committing suicide is debated. But that's the kind of thing the movie does in abundance. Half-truths and a kind of celluloid cognitive dissonance, so that it doesn't deviate from the narrative it wants to make, where Bugsy is a tragic, lovable character. But in doing so, they miss an opportunity to make these characters, and in particular Bugsy, fleshed out and complex individuals, and instead they come off as surface-level representations and perhaps even caricatures. Of course, that's coming from a historical viewpoint. If one were to look at this film as a work of fiction, most of those complaints are mute, and to the film's credit, it does get a lot of things right with minute details, like Sedway and Gus Greenbaum walking into the Flamingo Hotel after Bugsy's death and assuming control over it. That really happened. Or how Bugsy had lavish food and female visitors in prison. I was not convinced with Warren Beatty's performance as Bugsy. I don't mind him being too old for the role, and he did do well with giving off the charming vibe of Bugsy, but he was lacking in other departments, and sometimes his goofy skipping around became tedious. He was hamming it up like it was still the 1930s. I know they're trying to paint him as not quite on the same wavelength as the vicious gangsters around him, that he's the dreamer surrounded by greaseballs only concerned with money. But the way it comes off is that Warren Beatty looks like he turned up to the wrong film, like he thought he was supposed to be starring in some warm family comedy, whereas everyone else is prepped for a serious period drama. Beatty actually looks like he's going to burst into a song at some point in the film. The parts where they showcase Bugsy's sociopathic rage were kind of embarrassing, really. I just couldn't buy it. It seemed phony. There's one part where he's all charming and then launches into a tirade when someone calls him Bugsy, because he doesn't like being called that. But it just felt flat. Beatty didn't have it in him to elicit the kind of fear that we should have felt. And to think this came a year after the classic funny house scene from Goodfellas. And there's another part where Bugsy goes skits at a character in a room, and he's screaming and shouting, and all this time I was struggling not to grin. I was genuinely unsure whether this was played for laughs or not, but then he comes out of the room and his girlfriend is in a state of shock, and I thought, oh, this was supposed to be a serious scene. And then it just gets weirder, because even though they just had a fight before this scene, Virginia gets turned on by Bugsy's tantrum and is immediately all over him. They could have played that like an exploration of their narcissism, about how she was attracted to violent men, but the music suggests it's a tender romantic love scene between the two. I felt quite sick. I know Oscars have nothing to do with the quality of the films themselves, but I wanted to talk a little bit about them. The movie had loads of nominations. It was one of those glossy, big-budget productions. But a lot of it just seems to be a case of big names being nominated for being big names. Ennio Morricone is my favourite film composer of all time, and he's been screwed over so many times by the Academy. And yet by his high standards, the score for Bugsy is pretty ordinary. And for the life of me, I can't work out why Harvey Keitel and Ben Kingsley were nominated for Best Supporting Actor. Keitel is a magnificent actor. Have the Academy seen films like Bad Lieutenant and Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore? He's been snubbed throughout his entire career, and then his only nomination is for a performance where he really doesn't do anything except standing around smoking. He was just kind of there, really. They could have explored how Bugsy's extreme spending and unorthodox methods were affecting Mickey Cohen, or how he apparently reacted violently to Bugsy's death in real life. But they just kind of had Keitel hanging around in the background of many scenes, and apparently this was enough to warrant an Oscar nomination. He can do these kind of films in his sleep. It's insulting to think that this is his only Oscar nomination. Kingsley as well, who was in the film even less, I believe, another remarkable actor, but one who just kind of stared blankly and spoke in a funny accent in the film. I was not overwhelmed with this movie, but neither was I underwhelmed, as I enjoyed the period setting and numerous scenes were entertaining. I was quite simply whelmed. I know it's cliché to say this, but I can only imagine how epic this would have been if Martin Scorsese would have made it. Oh well, but at least we got Casino from him. Bugsy is a rather sanitized account of one of the most interesting mobsters of the 20th century, and too romanticized for my liking. It feels safe and Hollywoodized. It's a film made 50 years too late. I give this one a 6 out of 10.